On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the 5th Denman Forestry Issue Series entitled In Support of Washington's Non-Industrial Private Forest Landowners. We look forward to an exciting and informative program today. The purpose of the Denman Forestry Issue Series is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and educate our students, faculty, and staff, as well as resource professionals, landowners, and the public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment. The College of Forest Resources engages in a broad mission focusing on the sustainability of natural and managed environments, including urban and rural landscapes. Sustainability is manifested through programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban environments, and sustainable forest enterprises. Today, we focus on the private forest lands in our state that are managed by non-industrial private forest landowners, or NIPF. Issues related to the economic dimensions of sustainability are foremost in the minds of many of these landowners as they face implementation of new forest practices regulations adopted by the Washington State Legislature and signed by Governor Locke in 1999. These new regulations are often referred to as the Forest and Fish Rules because they were enacted to ensure the ecological sustainability of our state's forested, riparian, wetland, and associated resources within a socially sustainable environment. This slide illustrates what we mean by sustainability, where in this little triangular area that I'm pointing to is the zone where full sustainability involving all three metrics is achieved. Sustainability of our environmental and ecological services, as well as our natural resources, is only assured if the economic, ecological, and social metrics are kept in the proper balance. The proper balance across the three metrics of sustainability may differ for different classes of owners. For example, non-industrial private versus public, or non-industrial private versus forest industry. The proper balance will also shift from one landowner to another within the NIPF land ownership category. Sustainability tries to ensure that future generations have the opportunity to enjoy the same products and amenities produced by our forest lands that we now enjoy. This slide illustrates the lack of sustainability, as at no point do the three circles interact, except for that little sliver where the pointer is right now. Our college is helping to address these new realities in many ways, one of which being today's discussion involving the management of our non-industrial private forest lands. Finding the proper balance is not an easy task. It has been and continues to be a wrenching transformation for many private forest landowners in Washington state. Large shifts in wealth are occurring as a result of this paradigm shift. A commitment to resolving these issues is paramount, for we believe that the shift towards sustainable management and higher standards of forest stewardship is irreversible and will grow stronger in future years. The new Farm Bill that was signed by President Bush on May 13th contains many new programs of importance to NIPF owners. Some of our speakers today will likely address some of these new programs. I wish to point out just two. The Sustainable Forestry Outreach Initiative is a new initiative under the Renewable Resources Extension Act that is designed to educate landowners regarding the value and benefits of practicing sustainable forestry and the importance of receiving professional forestry advice in achieving those objectives. In repealing the Forestry Incentives Program and the Stewardship Incentive Program, a new program, the Forest Land Enhancement Program, was created. This program will be funded at a level of $20 million per year over the next 5 years, and the program's goal is to establish a coordinated and cooperative federal, state, and local sustainability forestry program for the active management and restoration of forest on NIPF forest lands. Institutions of higher education are also asked to play an important role in this new effort. Turning to the importance of our discussion today, we need only look at a few summary statistics for Washington State. First, I wish to point out that about 60% of the state's commercial timberland lies in western Washington and 40% in eastern Washington. These 16.1 million acres cover about 38% of our state's total land area. 44% of this area is publicly owned and 56% privately owned, with NIPF and forest industry owners being about equal in their ownership. If we look at the status of the timber inventory, we see that 53% of the standing timber is publicly owned and 47% privately owned, with the NIPF and forest industry being just about equal in their inventory volumes. And lastly, in 1999, public lands contributed only 18% of the statewide harvest, while private lands made up almost 82%. NIPF owners accounted for 39% of the total harvest from only 20% of the commercial timberland area. These few slides begin to help us identify the problems we are here to discuss today. Private timberlands in our state are producing an increasing share of the timber harvest on a shrinking land base, while simultaneously being subjected to increasing regulatory pressures to provide a growing array of environmental services, amenity, and other public values. Who are the people that make up the NIPF ownership class, and how many of them are there? According to Birch, there are over 90,000 forest landowners in our state. Now, during the program today, some of our speakers may use different estimates of the number of landowners, as different measuring criteria are oftentimes used. So just keep that in mind. The demographics of an average NIPF owner are also interesting. The following figures, reported by Blattner and Baumgartner in 2000, reveal that the typical owner is about 57 years old, has been a landowner for 23 years, likely lives in a city of 5,000 or more people, and has a family income in excess of $50,000 per year. Lastly, the typical owner is very likely to be a male Caucasian. The typical owner has holdings that look something like this. The forest area is about 40 acres in size. That's the median value. The property is very likely to be owned by one person who is likely to allow public access and lives on the property. Non-resident owners are likely to live 50 or more miles from the forest property, and about 1/4 of the landowners have a fish-bearing stream on their property. Our program today consists of speakers from government, higher education, and the NIPF sectors. They will discuss the types of technical and educational assistance available to NIPF owners, some outreach and technology transfer programs such as the Rural Technology Initiative and the Small Forest Landowner Office, problems and obstacles encountered by a practicing tree farmer in Washington State, and lastly, an update on the Private Forest Forum. Growing recognition that our non-industrial private forest lands play a significant role in providing a variety of products, environmental services, and public values is the subject of today's discussion. I am sure that we will hear a variety of interesting proposals for changing and improving policies that affect these lands. I wish to thank all of today's speakers, as well as those who helped organize this event. I applaud your contributions because I believe the future of forestry and natural resource management in Washington State lies in promoting the sustainable management of our state's natural resources. With these brief comments, I will turn the podium over to Associate Dean Bob Edmonds, who will introduce the rest of our program.
First, I'd just like to introduce the panel. To my right is Steve Gibbs, and then Don Hanley, Bruce Lipke, Steve Stinson, and Dave Townsend. So I've organized these questions into four categories, some of which will be specifically for the speakers and some more general. And these four categories are to do with forest land conversion and rules, costs, education and data availability, and then a number of questions to do with broader concerns and if there have been any successes associated with the current situation. So my first question then is for Don Hanley, is what do you mean when you use the phrase land conversion?
Well, I think our last speaker, Dave Townsend, addressed that quite well. Land conversion into some use other than forestry, urbanization pressures, agricultural use, what have you. Well, I interact with a lot of landowners on a regular basis, and they clearly do have the opportunity in many cases to convert their land to a more of an economic return. Clearly, many of them are just like Dave Townsend, and it's going to hurt them to do that. But that's what I was referring to, is the alternative land use that they all have available to them.
Okay, I have a question for Steve Stinson, or actually it's a two-part one here. How does a small landowner determine if they have fish-bearing streams? And the second part is, what would be the advantage of a habitat conservation plan as compared to the forest and fish regulations?
Okay, fish-bearing streams. Right now we're in the process of developing a habitat model within the Department of Natural Resources that will take a shot at that. Right now we're basically down to taking wildlife biologists out to your stream and making on-site physical determinations as to whether they meet the criteria for potential habitat. Habitat Conservation Plan is part of the Endangered Species Act, sections 10, 9, and 8. And basically what a habitat conservation plan will allow you to do is to put together a long-term management strategy for your property that will allow you to live in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. In the state of Washington, with the advent of forest and fish, pertinent sections of the HCP will then become your forest practices rule. So in a nutshell, you'll have long-term regulatory certainty under the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, and State Forest Practices Act. As Mr. Townsend so aptly stated, tree farming or forestry is a long-term business, a minimum of a 50-year investment, and it's just very, very difficult to make the kinds of plans and management decisions necessary without having some sense of regulatory stability. I believe the HCP process will provide that for small landowners.
Just a follow-up on that with another question. Does every landowner in Lewis County have to agree or buy into the ACP for it to be accepted?
Absolutely not. It's voluntary. So a landowner would do so on their own free will.
Okay. Question for Steve Gibbs. Cost shared programs. It says afforestation versus reforestation. What is the difference?
Afforestation is basically planting where there are not trees now, such as planting an old pasture, that type of thing. Reforestation would be replanting after you've harvested. We don't cost share reforestation in this state because it's required by law under the Forest Practices Act. Other states that don't have Forest Practices Act do cost share that, but in this state, Oregon, California, and others that have that type of requirement, we do not use the USDA funds for that.
Okay. And then a general question. Have agencies attempted to examine if regulations such as forest and fish tended to increase or decrease rates of forest land conversion? No specific name. Any of you want to tackle that one?
I'll give it a crack. And this goes right back to my pet topic, and that's a database with accurate information on non-industrial private landowners. Without that type of accurate information, you really can't take a shot at looking at the trends of conversion and how they are affected by regulation. So until we have that information, I'm afraid we probably won't be able to do that sort of analysis.
Bruce?
You can speculate, if you remember the one picture that he showed of that stream winding through the bottomland, and if you looked at that picture very closely, you could see that a lot of it has already converted, and if you've taken the motivation for the rest of it away, you can almost be assured that it's going to convert.
And I know there's a study that's underway at WSU that's looking at these issues relative to non-industrial landowner perspectives, and under the Professor Blattner and Baumgartner, they're looking at that exact issue, and that question was asked, and I know there's some data there. I don't have it with me right today.
Okay. Well, I'll move on and ask some questions about costs. Maybe this is for Steve Stinson or Dave Townsend. If NIPF landowners cannot meet the cost burdens of regulations, realistically, how will they cope?
Take a shot first, Dave.
That's a good question. We're not quite sure how we're going to cope. Way it looks like right now is that you're kind of forced to cut maybe some trees that you didn't want to cut simply to generate the income necessary to fulfill whatever particular requirement it is that you were faced with. And again, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. Does this meet any societal goals of, having cut down more trees just to meet that particular requirement? And if you do cut those trees down now, what does that mean 30, 40, 50 years out? We want to maintain an even number of management groups that can be cut periodically over time. If I have to deviate from that schedule, that's got longer term implications that need to be considered. But so right now there's not a good answer to that, and we're hoping that through various other cost share programs that some of those can be mitigated. Steve, you want to add to that?
Sure. I think a landowner really has two options when it comes to generating revenue from a tree farm. You cut trees or you develop land. It's really that simple. As Dave mentioned, developing land is contrary to the vast majority of tree farmers' goals and objectives, and cutting timber also raises some challenges right now. Timber markets are historically fluctuating, but we've seen a really interesting trend in our timber markets that hasn't really been addressed yet today, and that's that we've lost the market for our medium-sized, and I'm speaking greater than 30 inches, probably less than 50 inches diameter wood, which has always given the small landowner with longer-term plans a nice financial pie or target out there. And I think until we can recapture the values that we've previously seen for medium-sized wood, it's going to be increasingly difficult.
Here's a question that I just got hot off the press here. To backtrack a little bit in terms of background, it says, can you explain to the audience why Forest and Fish was negotiated? What regulatory risks were we facing in this state in 1996? I guess it's actually addressed to Steve Stinson.
I think the primary reasoning behind Forest and Fish was the Endangered Species Act and the potential listings of future salmonid species.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
Well, you picked the difficult part of the whole subject. The history in the state was that with the listing of the spotted owl, there were just lots of people that were seriously affected by that, and there was no history of sort of negotiated finding a solution to that problem. So it seems to me that one of the things that drove this negotiation more than anything else is we don't want to go that way again. We want to find a negotiated settlement, and so every effort was made to try to develop a negotiated settlement. The problem that most of us as economists have when you look at these sorts of things is while every attempt was made to make this a good settlement and a good agreement, there are all sorts of unintended consequences. And largely what you heard here today are some of the unintended consequences as they affect small owners.
Okay, there are quite a few questions here to do with cost of roads and culverts. That seems to strike a sore point. But one for Bruce Lipke is that, how did you come up with the crude estimates of the cost for small landowners on roads? What inputs went into your economic analysis?
There was a study done as a part of the Forest and Fish Regulations called the Small Business Economic Impact Assessment. As a part of that study, there were some surveys done on how much it would cost for some culvert changes that would be required by the legislation, all the way up to large fish passage areas that would require a new bridge, which might be $50,000. So there was a whole spectrum of costs. There was a sample area taken, and in that sample area, there was essentially a set of estimates made as to which kind of upgrade might be required for each one of these kind of road links to the stream. So it was a crude estimate largely because the sample isn't all that huge, and the costs are very variable, so that obviously as we go forward in time, we'll learn quite a bit more about what the true costs are. But another aspect of it is, of course, nobody was looking at, well, what's the cost effectiveness of this, whereas as we get out there in a case study sense, we'll be looking at, you know, how much benefit was actually derived from this as well.
There's also a question about what the RMAP's road standards are and the cost per foot. And if the state has no budget for its share of RMAPs, which is $250 million, how realistic is it to expect the this legislation to be enforced? So Steve Stinson, I suppose you were looking puzzled.
The RMAP people stayed home purposely on this.
Well, I don't think we really know what road maintenance and abandonment plans are going to cost. You know, it's kind of like asking what an average small landowner is like, and that's a difficult question too. I will say that the efforts that we're making to find cost-sharing funds for road maintenance and abandonment plans are directed at the federal level, which, you know, while things are tight there too, it seems like there's a little bit more opportunity there to come up with funding. I think that's probably the portion of the question that I'm most able to address.
And a final question on costs for Steve Gibbs. Can wildfire hazard reduction financial assistance be used for riparian layout costs and alternate planning?
Unfortunately, no. We get it from the federal government, and it's very specific for its use, so it has to be only for wildfire hazard type practices, such as defensible space or thinning and pruning. I might follow up on Steve's comment, though. We have been in discussions with the folks in the other Washington at the Forest Service cooperative programs, through which come USDA cost share programs such as the new Forest Landowner Enhancement Program, which, by the way, I would not anticipate that to be fully operational until perhaps next spring or so. There's even though it's passed in the Farm Bill, it'll still take some fleshing out at both the state and federal, state, and local levels to make that happen. But we made 3 points to those folks on our maps that landowners may need to have financial assistance in 3 areas. One is if they have to hire a professional to prepare the actual RMAP plan, such as a consulting forester or an engineer. Second, if they have to hire engineering expertise to actually design a stream crossing structure, that they may need financial help there. And of course, then the big ticket item is the actual installation of the structure itself. So we're pushing all 3 with the folks at the federal level. We think they've heard us, but this is kind of a unique thing to the Pacific Northwest. It's not something that's nationwide, but I think we have their attention.
Okay, well, I have a number of questions on educational aspects and data availability. And the first is for Steve Stinson. or Steve Gibbs, is the database defining a small owner available to, that Steve spoke about, available to the public?
Portions of it are. Anytime you're gathering data on a constituency of individuals, you know, you have some restrictions on what you can and can't do. But if commodity-based agencies or folks that are not out for profit are interested in some of the mailing list type of information, we've got some agreements that might be able to be worked out. And then, of course, the analysis and the data that comes from the analysis of that database, you know, will be published and available from a variety of sources. So I'd give that a qualified yes.
I might add to that, there's a state law that prohibits commercial use, I think that's what you're getting to, Steve, of assessor-type databases. So if you're not in business and not going to use it for business purposes, you should be able to access the data, but otherwise it's prohibited by law.
Okay, so this next question probably follows on then. How much inventory detail is provided in the forest stewardship plan related to acres by age and site class, for example?
Well, I'll address that relative to the coach planning. The landowners themselves determine that, and that again is based on what their ownership objectives are, what is measured in the inventory, and we don't try to put a standard on it. So there is a set level of accuracy, if you will, in terms of the number of plots per acre and the like. Again, it's for their use. So they need to simply have data and results that are available that they can utilize in their planning efforts.
Generally, a forest stewardship plan would include stand descriptions, ages, species composition, and that kind of thing. If you have this done by a consulting forester, which we can cost share and reimburse you for 75% of the cost of doing so, it does not include a timber cruise. So if you choose to have a consultant cruise your timber, in other words, establish the volume and the value that you have out there, that would be above and beyond the cost that would be publicly cost shared.
Okay, and this question also follows on to Don Hanley. How does the coached forest plans from extension training session relate to forest stewardship plan developed by the DNR?
Okay. The forest stewardship plan that is ultimately developed from either of those two alternative pathways would be the same. There are specific criteria that are met within each of what defines a forest stewardship plan, and the traditional way was to hire a consultant or to have a stewardship forester with the DNR prepare the plan. As I said in my prepared remarks, sometimes those plans were not implemented because the landowner didn't agree with what was there. Sometimes, not always. We developed the coach planning effort so the landowner had more say that was actually in the plan, and it was their plan. They wrote the plan, but then they needed coaching by a cadre of professionals to provide them with the technical background that they need to develop the plan. But they should result in the same thing.
Okay, there are a couple of questions to do with the availability of the landscape management system. The first one says, does any agency, organization, DNR, WSU extension, assist landowners in the use of the landscape management system and development of inputs into the system?
Well, the landscape management system is a fairly new tool. We've done a number of training courses with it. All the extension agents, which you noticed there aren't very many of in this state, on one of Don's slides. Anyhow, they've all been gone through a preliminary training with it. So it really gets down to there are a number of agencies that are picking up and using on it, but it's not to the stage yet that you have really broad-scale training activities supported by any of the agencies. Bureau of Land Management is using it in a number of places. DNR is actually experimenting with it in places. So there's just a lot of pilot places where the landscape management system is being used. There have been some 3,000 copies of it downloaded from the web. We haven't got the foggiest notion of how many people really have succeeded with it. We know of many cases where people are very happy with it, but it's not something that's very easy to keep track of.
The Small Forest Landowner Office regional field staff have also been provided training in the landscape management system, and while I wouldn't necessarily qualify them as experts from that training, I do think that they've got some of the initial skills that would help small landowners get the data necessary for inputs, and so we've got that going too.
And here's a person concerned about how many megabytes of computer capacity does the LMS use? Somebody with a small computer.
It's a PC-based system, and it isn't really that huge since there are many versions of it, and we'll be continuously changing versions. It doesn't take much more than a reasonably recent PC to handle it.
Okay. And then one final question on the education side of things is for Dave Townsend. What is the American Tree Farm Certification Program, and how is this certification being used by you, or has been useful to you?
Well, one way it's been useful for us is that Weyerhaeuser now requires certification in order to buy your wood. So it has been helpful to maintain, the economics in what we do sell. The rest of it is, getting back to the first part of the question, it's a program developed to encourage and recognize good stewardship. It requires a stewardship plan. It is largely tailored toward the landowner's own goals and objectives, so it is good in that regard. But I think mostly it's just, I'll call it recognition of good stewardship.
Okay. Well, the final group here to do with broader concerns and successes. So is there some effort taking place to determine if these regulations actually work as intended? It says Steve Gibbs' name on it, but I guess any of you could tackle that one.
Well, I think that the thing that should be raised there is, as a part of the Forest Practices Board, there is a process called CEMER, which is the research arm of the Forest Practices Board, and they have a several $million budget to completely set up monitoring and evaluation systems. So the answer to the question is, well, maybe not today, but eventually we'll get there. In other words, there's a lot of research taking place that will be able to tell us as we move forward in time how effectively these systems are working. But it's quite a different matter to say today that we have all of that already in place and we really have all the answers to that.
If I could add one comment to that, I think it's only human nature to try to, avoid regulations. And where the goals have been well defined, I certainly think that it's a much better approach to have incentives in order to reach those goals rather than regulations to force those goals.
Here's one for everyone. Which programs have proven to be effective based on 1, economics, and 2, ecology?
Which program, meaning?
Well, I assume has any of this worked really based on the economics or ecology? Or,
I mean, obviously,
is it too early perhaps to make a statement of that?
Obviously, the intent of all these programs is to improve the protection of the riparian zones for the benefit of salmon. I think the thing that we typically have trouble with is when you try to apply a one description fits all sites, you find out that there are lots of situations that are probably not the best. And I would cite the classic example of, we basically have almost all of our non-industrial private forest lands, those that are young, were planted with the intent of thinning. So you may have 1,000 trees per acre in this riparian management zone, and that's not a particularly desirable feature for this stand to progress over time to take on the conditions that are in fact the intent of the legislation. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why the first principle that shows up in alternative plans is almost always to thin more aggressively in these stands to try to put them on a path to achieve the desired future condition quicker.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think all these programs are working to some extent. We've got a very diversified constituency out there and a very complex set of situations for them to deal with. And so each program, you know, has a niche with that particular set of landowners and the needs and objectives that they have. I will take a minute to talk about the forest riparian easement program and the impact that it's had. As we mentioned before, forest practices rules do not eliminate the need or the the potential for conversion. If a person signs up for the easement program, they get a partial compensation for their impacts, and the state then in return sees that those trees are on the landscape, ensuring riparian function for another 50 years. So I think while all programs are working, the forest riparian easement program certainly is playing a part for its applicability to the landowners that are interested.
You know, I'll take a little broader approach to the question. You know, the land grant system has been around since the early 1900s, and specifically in forestry in this state, education of landowners has been around since prior to World War II. Through a collaboration of effort between the DNR, or the State Forester, and the Land Grant University. So clearly a government program of technical and educational assistance that's been around for almost 60 years or more probably is successful, or it wouldn't be around. From that perspective, why would it still be around if it's that old? The downside, though, is that I still don't think we're reaching the magnitude of the landowners. And I'd like to give you a quick example of that. We've got a landowner class going right now out on the Olympic Peninsula, and there's 40 landowners in attendance. And I asked them the very first time we met, are you aware of the rules and regulations associated with forest land management? 30 of the 40 had no idea they were regulated at all except for reforestation. And that's been around for probably 50 years or close. So we're not reaching the magnitude yet. And that to me is the failure. And I think the feedback that we're seeing, we haven't hit the tip of the iceberg yet. And when more landowners find out what's going on, this is gonna snowball and continue.
I'd have to agree, and I think if you look at landowner use of programs or what they appreciate from the 1999 study that WSU conducted, the highest and most valued was education, shortly followed by technical assistance, which is consistent with what Don said, the partnership there between education and on-site assistance. And then a distant third was financial incentives as far as what the landowners value and use.
Okay, so I have one final question. Where does a citizen, not a NIPF landowner, go to express concern about this? DNR, legislature, anywhere else? So how do you express yourself on this if you're not an NIPF landowner?
Well, I would assume that would be the state legislator for that particular locale where the person's located. And isn't that the way we always get our comments across in the legislative or policy arena?
From a regulatory standpoint, it would be the state legislature and/or the Forest Practices Board. For a funding standpoint, if you're concerned about funding for these programs, the Stewardship program is funded about half by USDA Forest Service and half by state funds. So both your congressional folks and your state legislators. And extension is the same, a combination of state and federal funds. Small landowners office is entirely state funded.
And I guess I would just add to that, particularly if you have a solution, give me a call.
Yeah. Can we pass the hat now?
Yes. Thank the panel very much, and I thank the people for providing these very good questions. So our final wrap-up presentation of the session is going to be given by Dr. David Thorud, who's the Dean Emeritus of the University of Washington College of Forest Resources. He's been a proponent of university private sector collaboration in support of forest stewardship and productivity. He was a participant in establishing the Private Forest Forum, which will be touched upon in his remarks. So the title of his presentation is Private Forest Forum's Contribution to Forest Landowners. David.
Thank you, Bob. Well, today's program, which was made possible in part because of the generosity of Dick and Mary Ellen Denman, certainly highlights two important features about forest lands in Washington State, and in particular the non-industrial forest lands. The first one is that these lands are very significant in total area. About half of the total private forest land acreage of the state, somewhat in excess of 3 million acres. It's not an inconsequential number. And also that we have a lot of people that are involved. Anywhere from 40 to 91,000 people are non-industrial private woodland owners in our state. And that's something I want to touch on again. I think that's something maybe we ought to work on a little bit, see if we can't articulate a little more accurate characterization. So the importance of the lands is unequivocal. Secondly, there's a growing assistance infrastructure to help the small forest landowners, many of whom understandably do not have a formal background in forestry and maybe not even informal training in forestry. And these assistance programs that you've heard about today recognize that owning and managing forest lands, for whatever the objective, has become a very complex proposition, and that's especially so if timber management is one of the objectives. So I think the program has very nicely highlighted the importance of these lands and also that society is responding with assistance programs. Clearly, non-industrial forest lands play an extremely important role in our state, including the provision of wildlife habitat, watershed protection, biodiversity, recreation opportunity, aesthetic benefits, and of course timber production. I think the private non-industrial forest landowners, for example, provide about 30%, somewhere in that range of the total timber production in our state, which is very substantial. Our state is a big timber producer. Now we know that different owners have different objectives. For example, some are interested in timber production, many others are not. We also know that government recognizes the importance of forest lands in our state for their many values. King County encourages retention of land and forest cover through zoning, for example. This is not without controversy for landowners, that's for sure, but it's predicated on the notion that forest cover, including forests managed for timber production, has important societal benefits. And clearly the state has a similar view. The State Forest Practices Regulations reflects a statewide concern for forests, and simultaneously it does introduce a significant complexity for the landowners, especially in a state like ours, which has some of the most demanding forest practices regulations in the country, as Steve Stinson pointed out, if not the most demanding these days. So recognizing that private forest lands are important, extremely important in our state, a feature of our state, and yet they face many, many challenges and complexities. A group of people in the forest sector got together in 1998 to examine ways that landowners, both small and large, non-industrial as well as industrial landowners, could be assisted in the successful stewardship of their properties. The state's two research universities got together and as part of the, were participants, Washington State University as well as the University of Washington. The UW was represented by the College of Forest Resources, and Washington State University was represented by the Department of Natural Resource Sciences and the Cooperative Extension Service. So the two research universities have been heavily involved in this dialogue. The Washington Farm Forestry the Washington Farm Forestry Association joined in to provide a voice from the non-industrial forest landowner. So we heard from that group was represented. In the industrial forest sector, the Weyerhaeusers and the Simpsons of the world, which includes a comparable amount of acreage, I think it's somewhere around 4 million or more of production land, is represented in this group through the Washington Forest Protection Association. So these forest groups, the two universities, the Washington Farm Forestry Association and the Washington Forest Protection Association, started off. In this nucleus of 4 organizations, we termed it the Private Forest Forum. We then in turn reached out to other cooperators, mainly the State Department of Natural Resources. So you've heard from this Small Forest Landowner Office this morning. They're a party to this. Forest Stewardship Program is a party to this. We also reached out to the USDA Forest Service to provide a federal perspective. And in addition, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service has been involved from the federal government. And clearly you also heard from the Rural Technology Initiative with Bruce Lipke articulated for you The Rural Technology Initiative is housed here at the UW, but it serves the whole state in collaboration, again, with WSU. So all of these parties are working together to say, how can we assist landowners, large and small, with the stewardship issues that they face, forest landowners in our state. And a principal purpose of the forum, it doesn't have a lot of formal structure to it, but a principal purpose of the forum is to facilitate dialogue on the needs of private forestry interests. And indeed, I would submit that today's Denman program is a case in point. Although today we were just focusing primarily on the non-industrial sector. Another objective of the Private Forest Forum is to identify ways in which the research and technical and teaching capabilities of the two states' research institutions can help address the needs of both small and large private landowners in Washington state. I think both of our universities see this as an important contribution that we can make, where we're asked to and where people want us to help. Let me say that some of the specific goals of the Private Forest Forum include better communication between small and large landowners. They often have different agendas, as you well know, and so we're trying to facilitate that dialogue. Secondly, to have a greater understanding of and cooperation with the legislative, the regulatory, the public, environmental, and academic sectors in our state that have an interest in forests. Third, where possible, to help with consensus building among the involved parties as needed and as requested. We are not imposing ourselves on anybody as somebody to solve your problem, but if there's a way that the Private Forest Forum can serve as a venue to deal with important and controversial issues, trying to find some solutions, it's there to be called upon to do that. The fourth item is to identify, as you might expect, research needs in forest management, forest ecology, and natural resource policy. Both universities have faculty and staff that work in all of these sectors. The fifth is dissemination of research on technical and policy issues relevant to private forest lands. And lastly, we'd be remiss to not mention this, to help students become better stewards of forest land, both personally and professionally. So that's sort of an ambitious goal, and we've gotten a start. In March of 2000, we held what we called a conference, which we called Summit 2000, which was a comprehensive discussion on the biological, social, and economic viability of private forests in Washington state. That proceedings has been published, and it's just packed with information. And we think that it's provided some basis for policy issues that have emerged since the conference was given. And the proceedings was distributed, obviously, to the attendees as well as to policymakers in the state. A couple of things that came out after this, we provided support for the authorization of a Forest Products Commission to promote the health in our state of the forest products sector. Provided support for the Washington State DNR in terms of the small landowner office to help landowners access government assistance programs, as Steve Stinson outlined earlier, and we will continue to do that. And we also provided an institutional vehicle for the state to take advantage of faculty and qualified staff at WSU as well as at the UW to assist with third-party objective review of scientific reports that are being produced relating to the forest practices regulations through the SEMA process that Professor Lipke mentioned earlier. Reports get prepared, they want to have an independent, impartial review, and we have established, in cooperation with the DNR, a process to take those reports and have them reviewed by qualified faculty and staff at the two institutions. What do we see in the future here? What's on the horizon for the Private Forest Forum? Well, we've already begun discussions about having another conference in 2003. And this is at a very early stage, so we haven't defined specifically what that would be, but it would include, I'm sure, a focus on the sustainability of Washington State's private forests as a follow-up to the Forest and Fish Practices legislation that was actually officially implemented, I think, on July 1st of 2001. And I would anticipate that proposed action items and fresh recommendations relating to private forest issues will be a result of this conference. There's so much change and it's so rapid in our state that having a conference at 2-year intervals I don't think there'll be any problem in identifying issues that the private forest forums can contribute to. I would say perhaps one, just listening to this morning, if you agree with me, perhaps there should be a review of the unintended consequences of forests and fish with a focus on how to fix it, not just to complain about it, but how to fix it, how to move ahead and make it work for everybody. Another one that I might respectfully suggest is maybe we need to have somebody take a look at how many non-industrial private forest landowners do we have in our state, so that we don't have 4 or 5 people with, you know, very respected folks up here giving us different numbers. We know it's somewhere between 40 and 91,000. Surely we can do a better job than that. And I know Don Hanley's saying, Thorold, you're oversimplifying the case. But I really do think there might be some value served if we had some analysis done and came up with a rational division and a characterization of who are our non-industrial private forest landowners in the state. So these are some of the things that may show up on the program. The planning group is now working on it. A second focus for the Private Forest Forum as we go into the future, in addition to 2003, will be the development of new training opportunities for natural resource professionals who provide technical assistance to private forest landowners. Even the professionals need to be updated with all the new information that's coming online. So I think the Private Forest Forum and the 2 universities working together will help facilitate that. Well, let me close by briefly relating what is going on nationally with regard to non-industrial private forest lands. And I think it is really significant and interesting to me that the role that non-industrial private forests in our state is, the role that it plays in our state is almost mirrored, is more or less mirrored nationally. For the U.S. as a whole, approximately 60% of the nation's forests are in a non-industrial private forest ownership, 60%. So in other words, more than half of the nation's forests are categorized as non-industrial private forest lands. And that's about 9.5 million people nationally that are in that category. Now, much of this land is threatened by urban sprawl. It serves as watershed protection and constitutes much of the most productive timberland in the United States. According to John Gordon of Yale University, these non-industrial forest lands of the nation supply more than half of the industrial wood requirements of the United States. So they're really significant in that regard, while providing biodiversity benefits as well. So you look nationally, you'll see many of the same themes that we've been grappling with in our state and have talked a bit about today. So what we're addressing here in our state certainly is not an anomaly. So I'd like to just conclude with those remarks and say that to the audience that I hope you had a chance to learn some things today about non-industrial private forest lands. And I know that most of the speakers put up websites and email addresses and phone numbers, and I also know that they will more than welcome contacts from you, the audience, if you have any needs for information or if you have questions that you'd like to put to them. Before I close, though, let's give a hand to our speakers here who so ably helped us here today get a better handle on this.